Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're exploring an encounter that two disciples had with the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus, though they didn't recognise him until he broke bread with them. Before we dive into exploring that, if you've not done so already, you might find it helpful to download the sheet accompanying this study, and you can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, verses 13 through to 35. Following the crucifixion of Jesus, some of the women who'd been with Jesus from Galilee and come with him to Jerusalem were awaiting the chance to anoint his body that had been laid carefully in the tomb with spices that they'd prepared prior to the Sabbath, as we learn in chapter 23, verses 55 and 56. That kind of anointing someone for burial, a last act of respect and care, was not permitted to be done on the Sabbath day. And so early in the morning after the Sabbath, the women returned to the tomb, only to find that the stone had been rolled away and two men in dazzling clothes were stood beside them. They told them that Jesus is risen, and they returned to tell the other disciples, including but not limited to the 11, as we learn in chapter 24, verses 1 to 10. Verse 11 of chapter 24 tells us that the other disciples did not believe their testimony, but that Peter ran to the tomb to see for himself, and he found the tomb empty and the burial garments that Jesus had been wrapped in neatly folded and laid out. He went away amazed and perplexed. Today's reading takes place primarily on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which, as we learn in chapter 24, verse 13, was about 7 miles long. And it also focuses on the house in which the two disciples on the road lived, as we hear about in verse 29. So in this passage we have Jesus, the risen Jesus, who was not initially recognised by the two disciples on the road, but nonetheless opened the Hebrew scriptures to them. We have Cleopas, who was a disciple of Jesus, returning to his home in Emmaus after the crucifixion. And we have another unnamed disciple accompanying Cleopas. Now, some have speculated that this may have been Cleopas's wife, because it seems they shared a home, but very often it's been depicted as two male disciples. It may be that there's a degree of unconscious bias there in how this has often been read. But what we do know is that neither Cleopas nor this unnamed disciple were part of the 11, and I'll say a bit more about that later. In this particular Easter season, we've been jumping around a lot between the different Gospels. Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written, likely around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, to a predominantly Gentile community based around modern-day Syria. And this resurrection appearance is uniquely described within Luke's Gospel, doesn't appear anywhere else. Now, as we learn in verse 13, the two disciples were on the road back to the village of Emmaus, making that 7-mile journey. We don't know precisely where Emmaus was, but we know it was a village not far from the city of Jerusalem. Verse 33 tells us that they were not part of the 11 because they rushed back after they'd recognised Jesus to tell the others. But we do know that Cleopas and his unnamed companion were mulling over the events as they walked, verses 13 and 14. A strange man, whom they did not recognise, appeared on the road, came alongside them and inserted himself into his conversation, began walking with them, as we learn in verses 15 and 16. And the strange man was asking these two disciples what they were talking about, as we learn at the start of verse 17. Now we learn in the latter part of that verse that this question provoked sadness, out of which the named disciple, Cleopas, began outlining the events that had happened to this stranger. And that makes up the content of verses 18 to 24. Jesus' earthly ministry is summarised in verse 19 when he is described as a prophet, mighty in word and deed before God and all the people. And yet, as verse 20 tells us, Jesus had been crucified by the Jerusalem religious authorities, pushing him into that situation. The symbolism of rising on the third day is noted in verse 21, together with a really poignant lament about these disciples' hopes for Israel's redemption. And it begs the question, what kind of Messiah did they hope for versus the kind of Messiah Jesus actually proved himself to be? They recounted the amazing events just before they had set out on the road, the astounding discovery by the women of the empty tomb and the vision of angels in verses 22 and 23. And finally, they said that they were among a wider group of disciples who'd gone to see the tomb for themselves, verse 24. So it wasn't just Peter who went to investigate following the testimony of the women. It included Cleopas and his unknown companion as well. Now the stranger, it seems, turns the tables on them. In verse 18, the two disciples are saying, how can you be the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know this stuff? But now Cleopas and friend were being revealed as the ones who were in the dark. They were slow, it seems, to realise that what had happened to Jesus needed to happen as a result of his being the Messiah, verses 25 to 26. And on the road, Jesus drew on the Hebrew scriptures, which is what would have been meant by scriptures at that point in time. Specifically, when it says Moses, it means the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and the ministry of the prophets, which at the time would have included the Psalms that were regarded at that point as prophetic texts. And as we learn in verse 27, what Jesus does with these texts is to reveal from them what it was that needed to happen to the Messiah. So, as we learn later on, setting the hearts on fire of those two disciples. That's verse 32. Now we don't know what texts Jesus specifically drew upon, but we do know, as I said, that the disciples were profoundly moved and excited. Their hearts were set on fire by what Jesus had to say to them. Yet they still didn't recognise him. There's a whole lot of background questions that are raised by this detail. Some about how the Hebrew scriptures are to be understood and interpreted in the New Testament. Some about different understandings within Judaism about what the Messiah was meant to be all about. But also something about how just engaging with the scriptures, important as that is, wasn't quite enough for those disciples to recognise the risen Jesus, and that matters. Now, by the time they reached the village of Emmaus, by the time they completed this 7-mile journey, we're told it was going dark, evening was coming, and it looked like the stranger was going to carry on walking. So, in line with the norms of hospitality at that time, the two disciples invited this stranger who'd opened the scriptures to them to come and stay. See verses 28 to 29. And it was at the dinner table, as we learn in verse 30, that Jesus performed actions that would have been so intimately familiar from all the meals that the disciples had shared with him. in that he took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them. There's an echo perhaps of what happened with the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 9 verses 10 to 17. And I say from practice from so many other meals that was really familiar. And it's at this point in these familiar actions that the two disciples finally recognise the risen Jesus, who we learn in verse 31 instantly departed from them, leaving them to reflect, to say in verse 32, about how he had set their hearts on fire. Suddenly, it seems, everything made sense to them. And I really love Caravaggio's famous depiction of the Emmaus meal, with one of the disciples almost falling backwards off his chair and going, oh, as if to say, how could I have been so blind as to not see this all along? Now, despite the fact that it was going dark, and despite the fact that 7 miles is a decent distance to cover in one day, we're told that that very hour the two disciples went back to Jerusalem, so another 7 miles, this time in more treacherous conditions, to tell the others gathered in Jerusalem still what they had experienced. It's verse 33. And this wider group told Cleopas and friend that they knew Jesus is risen and had appeared to Simon Peter, in verse 34. And Cleopas and the other disciple in verse 35 then shared more of their experience. So there was a mutual exchange of resurrection encounters. I think this text is one of the pivotal texts within the New Testament. Not least, it offers a profound model for presbyteral ministry, for the kind of ministry that I exercise as a Methodist minister. It's a ministry that's both about opening up the scriptures and setting people's hearts on fire, but it's also about the sacramental side of things, in helping people to recognise the risen Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Hence, that holding together of word and sacrament in this text has been pivotal for me, and many commentators have remarked on how Eucharist, the Thanksgiving meal of the Church, Holy Communion, to use a different name for the same thing, seems to be really at the heart of this passage. And indeed, in terms of the early church's developing understanding of Holy Communion, the Road to Emmaus story was one of the foundational texts. So there's a lot here to think about as we now come to our questions for this week.